Let's get down to Mr. Wesley. We've dealt with history. Mr. Wesley was a remarkable person, and I'll not spend a lot of time on him. He's now relatively well known. But he is the author, of course, of what we call Wesleyanism. He is the one who kind of first set the parameters and set the ideas and used the scriptures in a way that helped him to understand the plan of salvation, which is passed on down to us in what we call Wesleyanism. He was not always well known in the theological and religious world. He was well known in the religious world of his time, but Wesley kind of faded out of understanding and importance about the early part of the 19th century, even in Methodism. And it wasn't until about 1930 that the Methodist Church as a whole, the larger Methodist Church, came to recognize Wesley again and talk about him and read about him. Wesley was not much regarded by the general Christian community. He was looked upon as an Arminian. The Wesleyan movement labors under the burden of many of the patterns which have been set by the more dominant Calvinistic movement out of the Reformed Church and Calvin and so forth in Europe. Because Calvinists are very much afraid of the word perfection, which was one of Wesley's doctrines, as we'll see. And Calvinists are very much concerned about the item of free will, which was his Arminianism. In other words, we have something to say in our salvation, not to its basis, but to its response. We have to reply to God. Wesley had something to say about that. But both free will and the understanding of predestination and so forth were so dominated by the Reformation, by Calvin and Luther from the 1600s. Were so dominated by that the result is that Wesleyanism came in as a kind of later addition. But it did that because Wesleyanism brought the element of Christian experience and Christian perfection back into the dialogue about what Christianity really is. And the result is that Wesley became kind of a third person on the Luther-Calvin duo. It became a trio. And today, when we talk about the Reformation, the Christian Reformation, which we broke away from the Catholic tradition in the church and began what we call the Protestant tradition, the two main founders were Luther and Calvin. They were the big leaders. There were others. But over 100 years later, or almost 200 years later, came Wesley with something that they had not included, and that was Christian experience and the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives.